He arrived like a shadow dressed in flesh, his steps measured, his voice heavy with the weight of unseen chains. The people who gathered before him whispered that the world outside had grown too cruel, too bitter, and that he alone carried a refuge within him. He did not smile often, but when he did, it was thin and deliberate, as though joy itself had been taught to obey. Always his dark glasses remained in place, twin mirrors that reflected back not what was, but what the onlooker feared might come. They said he could look through you, past skin, past bone, past whatever sanctuary the soul thought it had. Behind those lenses his eyes never blinked, never softened, as though they belonged not to a man but to some ancient watcher carved out of night itself. Those who dared to meet his gaze swore something colder than belief stared back at them, something that did not hunger for love but for surrender. The hall where he first preached was dim, its windows shuttered against daylight. Candles sputtered along the walls, their flames bending as though cowed by his presence. The air smelled faintly of wax and damp wood, but beneath it lingered something sharper, like iron warmed too long in the hand. The people sat close together, knees almost touching, as though afraid to leave space for anything else to slip between them. When he spoke, his words spread through the room like smoke, curling into every corner, seeping into lungs until breathing felt like prayer. "The world has forgotten you," he said, his voice low and patient, "but I will not. I will gather you, bind you, and no one shall break what we build." The listeners bowed their heads. Some wept softly, tears streaking cheeks as though the words themselves carried absolution. Others clenched their hands, not knowing why they trembled. There was no pulpit, no ornament of faith behind him, only a plain wooden chair and the thick shadows that clung like cobwebs. Yet when he leaned forward, glasses catching the faint light, he appeared taller than the rafters, broader than the walls, as though the room itself bent around him. Children fidgeted in their mother's arms, but when his gaze swept across them, they fell still, their small mouths tightening into silence. An infant began to wail at the back, a raw and helpless cry. The man with the dark glasses tilted his head slightly, and without a word, the mother rose and carried the child out. The door shut softly behind her, but the crying did not follow. Those who remained exchanged no glances. To look at one another might break the spell. "I see a new land," he whispered so faintly they leaned forward to hear. "A place where no hunger gnaws, where no cruelty reigns. The world beyond these walls will mock us, despise us, but we shall drink from a purer cup." The way he spoke of it made some tremble with joy, others with dread. But none left. None ever left. It became a ritual. The glasses, the silence, the voice that pressed against their ribs. He walked among them slowly after each gathering, his hand grazing shoulders, his steps deliberate. And when his fingers brushed against someone's sleeve or cheek, they wept as if touched by flame. Some swore they caught a glimpse behind those lenses. Not eyes exactly, but pale lights flickering in a depth too far to measure. One woman claimed she saw her dead father's face staring back, his lips moving soundlessly. Another whispered that she glimpsed herself, but her reflection's mouth was smiling when her own was not. None spoke such things aloud in the hall, but rumors grew like mold in the dark, feeding on fear too sacred to confess. There was one who resisted, a boy, not more than 16, who stood stiff while the man approached. His hands were fists at his sides, his gaze steady. The man paused before him, tilting his head as though amused. "Do you not believe, child?" The boy's voice cracked but held. "I see only a man hiding his eyes." The hall gasped, a wave of breath like wind through leaves. The man with the dark glasses smiled, a slow, terrible smile that never reached his mouth. He leaned close, and though his voice never rose, every soul heard him clearly. "You will not speak again." And he did not. The boy lived, yes. He breathed. He walked among them still, but from that day not a sound left his lips. His throat bore no wound, his tongue no mark, yet silence clung to him as though sealed by tar. Those who witnessed this told the story in whispers, their voices trembling. Some claimed the boy's silence was proof of a miracle, that the man with the glasses had bound evil itself. Others knew better. They had seen what stared from behind those lenses, not salvation, not faith, but something colder, something waiting. And on the final night of that first season, when the hall lay empty and the candles guttered in their pools of wax, a lone figure cleaning the floor swore they saw him remain seated in his wooden chair, His glasses gleamed faintly, though no light touched them. The worker whispered his name. The glasses turned, slow as a noose tightening, and in the silence that followed, the worker swore, to the end of their days, that the dark lenses did not reflect their face at all. They reflected a jungle, thick and black, where no birds sang and no sky could be seen. The song began softly, a fragile thread of sound trembling in the air, as though each note feared to be heard. They gathered in rows upon rows of wooden benches, shoulders pressed tight, eyes lowered, voices rising in hymns that claimed freedom yet reeked of captivity. Every face was pale with devotion, every throat raw from repetition. It was a choir not of joy but of chains, a music scraped from the bones of the weary. They sang of deliverance, yet their voices faltered like birds with clipped wings, fluttering but never soaring. The hall, with its low rafters and its suffocating heat, seemed to lean in closer, swallowing the sound until even the strongest voices trembled into whispers. Every hymn rang hollow, an echo of promises carved from iron, heavy and inescapable. At the front, the man with the dark glasses sat still, hands folded, lips unmoving. He did not need to sing. The choir was his breath, the hymns his heartbeat. He watched with that terrible stillness, his lenses glinting in the candlelight, and the people shivered as though those black mirrors consumed each trembling note. A woman in the second row clutched her chest as she sang, her voice wavering. She was thin, her eyes hollow, yet she sang until blood spotted her lip. When she faltered, the man raised one finger, and silence fell across the congregation like a shroud. The woman's breath hitched in terror. Then softly he lowered his hand, and every throat opened again, not hers. She sat voiceless, her mouth open in a silent scream that no one dared to notice. "Freedom is not given," he murmured at last, his voice woven through the hymn like smoke. "Freedom is earned in sacrifice, and we have sacrificed more than the world will ever know." The words did not rise. They pressed downward, sinking into ribs and marrow. The congregation's song faltered again, breaking into sobs disguised as prayer. A boy, not yet 12, lifted his hands as he sang. His palms were scarred, fresh welts crossing the skin. No one asked why. The sound of his voice quavered like a bird's last cry before the snare tightens. Beside him, his mother joined in, her voice lower, steadier. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she did not stop. She sang louder when he faltered, covering his weakness with her own surrender. The walls of the hall were lined with cracked photographs, smiling faces, baptisms in muddy rivers, processions of followers clutching banners with words that now seemed like cruel spells. Their eyes in the photographs glowed faintly in the candlelight as though watching, judging, warning. The hymn swelled again, but the sound was wrong. Too heavy, too fractured. It seemed to carry no joy at all, only exhaustion, only grief dressed in melody. It was not the song of the saved, but of those who longed to be delivered from their deliverer. The man rose slowly, his chair creaking beneath him. His shadow stretched across the wall like a broken cross. "You're the wings," he said. His voice echoed as though the rafters themselves spoke with him. "And I am the air. Without me you cannot rise. Without you I do not move." The people murmured their assent, but the sound was thin, desperate. They spoke because to remain silent was to invite notice. From the corner, a lone voice broke free. A man older, his voice rough with years of shouting, sang louder than the others. His hymn was not quite the same melody. His eyes were clenched shut, his hands gripping the bench until his knuckles cracked. His song twisted, bending toward rebellion, toward something unbroken. The others tried not to look, but the air shifted, heavy with dread. The man with the dark glasses turned his head slowly. The song ceased. "Your wings are broken," he whispered, "yet you still flutter against the cage." The elder opened his eyes, sweat beading his brow. "Cages can be broken," he rasped. The hall gasped. The breath of 100 throats sucked sharp as a blade. The man with the dark glasses smiled, and it was colder than silence. He raised his hand once more, and 2 figures stepped forward from the shadows of the hall. Their faces were expressionless, their movements exact, as though strings guided their limbs. They took the elder beneath the arms and lifted him from the bench. He did not resist. He only sang louder now, hoarse and cracked, his hymn rising like a broken horn in a storm. The people bowed their heads, covering their ears, pretending the sound did not exist. The door opened. He was taken into the dark. The song ended with the slam of wood. The man with the dark glasses lowered his hand. The choir resumed as though nothing had happened, but their voices shook. The hymn stumbled, collapsing into a dirge that could barely crawl across the floor. "Sing," he whispered. And though his lips barely moved, the command sank into them like hooks. "Sing or you are nothing." And so they did. Their voices broke and wept, but still they sang, one by one, heads tilted upward, eyes hollow yet shining. Some sang until their throats bled. Others fell silent and wept, but moved their lips in pantomime, praying their silence would not be noticed. The song grew monstrous, a thing without harmony, only raw survival disguised as worship. When the candles guttered, the hall filled with smoke, thick and suffocating. Shadows bent along the walls, fluttering like wings not strong enough to lift. Those who remained after the hymn swore they heard something beneath the sound. A whisper, faint but insistent, echoing from the rafters. "We cannot fly. We cannot fly. We cannot fly." The first word fell from his lips like nectar, golden, slow, and glistening. And yet those who swallowed it tasted only smoke. The hall was thick with breath and silence, 100 bodies packed together, their eyes raised, their mouths shut, waiting. He stood at the front with his dark glasses gleaming, his voice rolling low and patient, filling every crack in the wood, every corner of the rafters. His words dripped sweet as nectar, but carried the taste of ash and charred bone, as though every promise was pulled fresh from a fire that had devoured too many offerings. He did not shout. He did not pace. His stillness was a snare. "You are chosen," he murmured, his tone soft as honey poured over stone. "Chosen to suffer so the world may forget you. Chosen to endure so the kingdom may rise." The congregation leaned forward, not because they wished to, but because his voice seemed to pull them by the chest. They wanted to believe, yet belief was no longer a choice. Every blessing he spoke was a bargain, signed in silence and sealed in fear. At his side, a table stood draped in white cloth. Upon it sat nothing ornate, only plain paper cups filled with water lined in a row. He lifted one slowly, holding it as though it were chalice and crown alike. "This cup is freedom," he whispered. "This cup is peace. The world outside fills their mouths with bitterness. I fill yours with sweetness." He drank, and the water slid down his throat. The congregation sighed as though they too had swallowed, as though the act itself was a communion shared in spirit. When he set the cup down, the silence deepened. A child coughed once, but the sound died instantly as the mother's hand clamped over his mouth. Behind him, a banner sagged from the wall. Once it bore bright letters proclaiming salvation, but the damp had warped the words, the paint smeared like old blood. Still, the people stared at it with trembling reverence, as though the letters shifted when no one blinked, spelling warnings they dared not speak. The sermon continued. His words grew thicker, sweeter, winding around the ribs like vines. "Love me as I love you," he whispered. "Fear me as you fear the Lord, for in fear there is safety and in obedience eternity." The hall shivered. Some wept openly, tears streaking their cheeks not in joy but in exhaustion, the kind of surrender carved from sleepless nights and long unbroken dread. One woman raised her hand, trembling. "Will we truly be free?" she whispered. The man with the dark glasses turned his head toward her. His voice softened further, a caress turned knife. "Freedom is the weight of chains you no longer feel." The hall bowed as though struck. Not all bent willingly. Near the back sat a man whose hands trembled against his knees. His eyes darted not toward the preacher but toward the exit. His lips moved soundlessly, as if rehearsing words he could not yet dare speak. He did not notice when the dark glasses turned toward him. "Some among you," the preacher murmured, "still dream of escape. They look to the trees, to the rivers, to the sky. But the jungle has no mercy, and the rivers only carry bones. I am the way through. I am the path that spares you." The man froze, his breath catching. The congregation shifted uneasily, though no one turned to look at him. His shame was their warning. The sermon bent darker still. He spoke of the world outside as if it were a graveyard, its soil salted, its air choked with the cries of the damned. He spoke of governments and devils as though they were the same. He spoke of safety, but the safety he promised sounded like burial. And yet his voice, oh, his voice was honey, warm and thick, drowning the senses, softening the terror. The people rocked in their seats, swaying gently. as if lulled by some unseen lullaby. "When the hour comes," he promised, "you will not fear. You will drink and you will be free, and your names shall be carved where fire cannot reach." The paper cups gleamed faintly on the table. Waiting, a child whispered to her mother, too soft for any but the nearest to hear. "What if the water turns black?" The mother shushed her, eyes wide, heart hammering. She dared not look at the man with the glasses, but his head tilted slightly as if he had heard, as if the words were no longer the child's to own. He spread his hands, and the hall grew so silent that even the night insects beyond the walls ceased their song. "If the water turns black," he whispered, "it is only because the world is poisoned. I will give you sweeter drink." The congregation nodded, though their throats were tight, their hearts cold. And then he smiled, not with warmth but with certainty. His teeth gleamed in the dim light, sharp against the sweetness of his voice. The candles flickered. The rafters creaked. Somewhere far in the jungle a howl rose, not of beast, not of man, but something caught between, something that had learned hunger from both. He did not flinch. "Drink when I tell you," he said, voice steady as stone. "Sing when I command you. And know your freedom has already been purchased." The jungle did not welcome them. It merely waited. The settlement rose like a wound cut into green flesh, a scattering of shacks and rough-hewn paths pressed into the soil, surrounded on all sides by trees that seemed too ancient, too patient. By day the leaves shivered with insects and the air buzzed with heat, sweat, and smoke. By night the forest grew thick and watchful, the branches bending closer as though the very canopy stooped to eavesdrop. The people whispered that the jungle breathed. They swore its shadows shifted when the torches burned low, and that unseen eyes blinked open between the roots. It was a cage without bars, a cathedral without mercy. The settlement rose where the forest grew thick and watchful. At night the trees leaned inward, listening as though hungering for the lives within. The first nights brought unease. The followers tried to sing to keep the dark away, voices trembling in the heat, but their hymns thinned quickly. For every note they raised, another sound answered, a low moan of wind that never moved the leaves, the clicking of unseen jaws, the rustle of something too heavy to be bird or beast. Some swore the jungle swallowed their voices whole, drinking them down like water poured into dry earth. Others claimed the forest sang back, its creaking branches forming words too vast for the human ear. Still, no one dared step beyond the lantern light. The trees stood like sentinels, their bark scarred with claw marks that had not been made by human hands. On the third night, a woman stumbled to the clearing's edge. Fevered and weak, she said she heard her name carried on the wind. The others tried to hold her back, but she tore free, running barefoot into the shadows between the roots. The darkness took her. They searched by torchlight, voices calling her name until their throats ached. No trace of her remained where, not a scream, not a footprint. Only the jungle closing its mouth as though nothing had ever passed between its teeth. When they returned, he was waiting, the man with the dark glasses standing at the center of the settlement, his hands folded. "Do not run to the trees," he said. His voice was low, steady, heavy as stone. "They are not your home. They are not your friend. The forest belongs to older masters, and their hunger is not merciful." No one spoke. No one asked questions. The days bled into weeks. The shacks sagged in the damp. The jungle crept closer, vines slithering over rooftops, roots splitting the paths. Each morning they woke to find the forest reclaiming a little more, as though testing their resolve. Children whispered that they saw faces in the leaves, not human, not animal, but twisted shapes watching with wide, patient eyes. When the adults silenced them, the children only pointed toward the tree line at dusk, where shadows leaned too far into the clearing. One child asked, in a whisper that froze her mother's heart, "Why do the trees smile when we cry?" Nights grew heavier. The air turned thick, swollen with the scent of rot and wet bark. Insects swarmed, biting until skin broke, and the people scratched until blood flowed. Yet the insects did not touch him. He sat unbothered, his dark glasses gleaming even when no fire burned. The people prayed not for salvation, but for silence. Yet silence never came. They began to hear knocking in the roots. 3 strikes, then pause. 3 again. As though something vast moved beneath the soil, mimicking their heartbeat. One man swore he saw the ground breathe. The soil rose and fell as though the jungle itself was drawing breath. waiting for the moment to exhale. On a night thick with thunder, a storm broke. Rain lashed the roofs, lightning carved the canopy into teeth, and the wind carried voices that were not human. The people huddled in the meeting hall, drenched and shaking. He stood before them, hands spread wide, voice steady above the storm. "This is no storm," he said. "This is the forest warning us. We live only because I tell it so. Without me, the trees would close their mouths upon you, and no one would remember your name." A bolt of lightning split a tree at the clearing's edge. It crashed to the earth, and when the smoke cleared, its trunk was hollow, burned through not by fire but by something that left no ash. Inside the hollow, something moved. Something pale, glistening, and gone before the torches reached it. The jungle shuddered, and the storm ended in a breath. After that night, no one dared walk alone. They moved in groups, always within sight of the lanterns, always whispering prayers under their breath. But the jungle still crept closer. Roots cracked the walls. Leaves pressed against windows, quivering though no wind stirred. At dusk, the children pointed again. Not to the shadows this time, but to the faces carved in bark. Faces that had not been there before. Mouths open, eyes hollow, watching. The towers rose before the people like crosses driven into flesh. Tall wooden spines crowned with figures that never slept. From their perches, the guards watched, rifles cradled like sacred relics, their silhouettes sharp against the swollen sky. The wood groaned under their weight, yet the towers never broke, as though some deeper root held them steady. From above, the guards looked down like unblinking idols, their gazes steady, cold, and endless. To be seen was to be measured, and to be measured was to be marked. The people learned to keep their heads lowered, their movements small, their breaths quiet. Each step through the settlement felt observed, as though invisible lines had been drawn in the dirt and every misstep would ignite judgment. Children ran only once, and when the guard's shadow stretched across them, their laughter stilled forever. No one spoke of it. No one asked where the child had gone. But at night, when the crickets hushed and the jungle shifted in its sleep, the faint sound of weeping drifted down from one of the towers. The watchtowers were not merely wood and nails. At dawn, the mist clung thick around their frames, and those who dared look too long swore the posts themselves bore carvings. Faces warped and screaming, their mouths nailed open, their eyes hollowed. Some said the guards had carved them for sport. Others whispered the wood had been taken from cursed trees, roots still dripping with blood when they were cut. But when lightning struck one tower during a storm, it did not burn. It stood blackened, unscathed, as though the fire feared it. "The towers keep us safe," he told them. The man with the dark glasses, his voice as steady as stone. "They watch for enemies who would tear us apart. To be seen is to be protected." The people nodded, murmuring thanks through dry lips. Yet their hearts knew otherwise. The towers did not protect. They confined. They measured. They marked. And once marked, there was no escape. It was said the guards never blinked. Their eyes remained wide, even in the glare of the sun, even in the drowning dark. Some swore the men in the towers were no longer men at all, but husks filled with silence, puppets that breathed only when commanded. A woman fetching water looked up once, just once, and found herself staring too long. The guard did not move, did not raise his rifle, yet the next day she was gone. Her shack stood empty, her belongings neatly folded, her cup still warm on the table. That night, her voice was heard humming a hymn, faint and cracked, drifting from the tower where the guard had stood. The people began to walk faster, speaking only when necessary. Their bodies shrank into themselves as though smaller shadows might escape the eyes above. But the guards always knew. At dusk, when the sun bled into the treetops, the towers glowed like skeletons. The guards' faces caught the last light, their eyes reflecting red, as though fire burned behind their skulls. Children whispered that the men were not men at all, but statues brought to life only to punish. And in the deepest hours of night, when the settlement lay still, some swore the guards climbed down, moving like shadows between the shacks, counting the sleepers, brushing the doors with hands too cold to be flesh. By dawn, they were back in their towers, rifles steady, eyes unblinking. One man, weary, half-mad with heat, decided to test them. At midday, when the sky boiled and the guards seemed statues, he walked to the clearing's edge, his steps slow, deliberate. The people froze, watching from their doorways, hearts clutched in fists of dread. He looked up, smiling, daring them. "I will not be measured," he said, voice rough, proud. The silence thickened. No shot rang. No guard moved. He laughed once, triumphant. And then, the guard raised a finger. Just one. The man collapsed where he stood, his body stiff, his eyes wide, his lips moving soundlessly until the life drained out of him. The people dragged his corpse away. None spoke his name again. That night the towers glowed faintly, though no torch burned within them. Eyes gleamed in the dark, unblinking, countless. Some swore the guards' silhouettes had multiplied, twice as many as the day before. Shadows upon shadows, stacked high like an army etched against the sky. The settlement shrank inward, fear pooling like stagnant water, and from that night on no one dared look up again. The first thing they heard was the drone of the engines, a sound that did not belong to the jungle. It rolled over the trees like a foreign hymn, shaking the air, stirring the leaves until they whispered uneasily. The people froze in their work, heads lifting in unison, eyes narrowing against the hot glare of the sky. Above, a silver body split the clouds, glinting like a blade. For a moment, hope fluttered. For a moment, the spell of silence seemed as though it might break. But in Jonestown, hope was a sin that always bled. The airstrip was nothing more than a scar of dirt carved into the jungle, a strip of earth where even the grass refused to grow. Its edges were lined with shadows, men leaning against rifles, their eyes hidden, their faces expressionless. They had waited for this day, and the ground beneath their boots seemed eager, as though it had thirsted long for blood. When the plane landed, a shiver ran through the settlement. Dust rose in a choking cloud curling like smoke as though the earth itself exhaled. Strangers stepped out, a congressman, his aides, a handful of reporters, and those weary few who whispered of leaving. Their clothes were too clean, their skin too pale against the dirt, their voices sharp and curious. They spoke in questions, and questions were daggers. "Why are the gates locked at night?" one voice asked. "Why are the people so thin?" whispered another. "Why do the children not smile?" The people lowered their heads, their lips trembling as if stitched shut. Every word might be heard, every glance might be marked. They felt the eyes of the towers pressing against their spines, felt the rifles humming in the air like hornets. And then he appeared, the man with the dark glasses. He came down the path as though the jungle itself had made way for him. The heat did not touch him, the dust did not cling. His smile was soft, his voice flowing like honey spilled from a jar. "Brothers, sisters, is welcome. All you see here is love." The strangers looked around, their brows furrowed, their pens scratching. His smile widened, but the air tightened as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. Behind him his guard shifted, shadows in human skin. Their hands lay easy upon their rifles, but their eyes gleamed sharp as glass. The air grew heavy with performance. Songs were sung, smiles forced. Children pushed forward to recite words they did not believe. The strangers clapped politely, their unease hidden beneath practiced courtesy. But cracks showed. A man slipped a note into a visitor's palm, his hand trembling as though reaching into fire. A woman begged with her eyes though her lips did not move. And always the watchtowers stared, the mask was slipping. And beneath it steel waited. The congressman rose. His words were calm, measured, but they rang through the air like bells tolling a funeral. "Some of your people wish to leave with us." A ripple tore through the crowd. Eyes widened, heads turned. The honeyed smile froze on his lips. For the first time the air stank of smoke. "They are free," he said, his tone still gentle, though a tremor coiled beneath it. "They are loved. They are safe." But love had chains, safety had walls, and freedom was a word that made the rifles twitch. The chosen few were gathered, their faces pale, their bodies shaking as though expecting lightning to strike them where they stood. Mothers clutched children, men held bundles, eyes darting toward the trees as if seeking escape. They were led to the trucks, the congressman at their head, reporters trailing with cameras glinting like knives. The airstrip yawned ahead, a strip of barren earth waiting like an altar. Dust rose once more, thick and choking. The jungle pressed closer, its branches arching like ribs over a carcass. And the guards followed, shadows stitched to the earth, their rifles whispering against their palms. At the airstrip, the engine roared, its voice promising flight, escape, another world beyond the green prison. The defectors climbed aboard, their eyes wide, their breaths sharp and shallow. The strangers smiled, brief, trembling smiles of those who thought they had won. But the jungle had closed its mouth. and the airstrip had no sky. A shout cracked the silence. A figure raised his hand. Rifles swung like pendulums, and then steel answered. The first shots tore through the air like curses, shattering the frail illusion of safety. The ground leapt beneath the fallen, dirt drinking quickly, hungrily. Screams split the air, drowned by gunfire, drowned by the roar of the plane's trembling engine. The congressman fell first, his body crumpling beside the wheel of the machine that would never rise. Reporters scattered, their cameras tumbling, film unspooling like entrails across the dirt. Mothers screamed, clutching children who bled into the dust. The earth drank deep, greedy. It had been waiting. When the rifles fell silent, only the jungle breathed. Smoke curled upward, thin and gray, vanishing into the canopy. The airstrip lay quiet again, its soil blackened, its silence thick as a shroud. The guards stood still, rifles cooling in their hands, their eyes unblinking. The strangers were no longer strangers. They were shadows folded into the earth, and above them all, unseen but certain, the man with the dark glasses smiled faintly. "No one leaves," he whispered. "Not alive." The first scream was not a scream at all, but a choked prayer swallowed by the dark. The people had gathered as they were told, their bodies pressed close, their breaths shallow. The pavilion loomed like a wooden coffin, its beams sagging beneath the weight of night. Lanterns burned low, casting shadows that stretched long and sharp across the dirt, bending the faces into masks of fear. They called it a gift, a final kindness, passed from hand to hand. But in every sip was a serpent, its venom winding through the veins of the faithful. The table stood at the center, a crude altar draped with white cloth already stained by trembling hands. On it the cups gleamed dull in the lamplight, their rims black as grave soil, their surfaces sweating as though alive. Beside them the vats breathed steam, sweet and sharp, the smell of almonds riding the air like a ghost. "Drink, children of light," the voice commanded. Smooth, unwavering, carved from stone. "Drink, and you will be free." The words wrapped themselves around the people, binding their hearts with invisible rope. The first mother stepped forward, her child clutched against her breast. Her hand shook as she took the cup, liquid trembling within it like a black mirror. She raised it, her lips parting, her eyes wide and wet. "For love," she whispered, though her voice cracked. Though the child whimpered against her, the cup tipped. The serpent slid down. The child convulsed first, his tiny body stiffening, a cry breaking into silence. The mother followed, her mouth foaming, her eyes rolling back into the sockets of the damned. The people wept, but no one moved. One by one, they came. Each step rang like a drumbeat, heavy, unending, tolling the march of the doomed. A man muttered a hymn as he drank, his voice breaking midway into a rattle. Another clutched his wife's hand until her body went still, her grip releasing only when the venom took him too. Children were pushed forward, their mouths forced open. The serpent poured down their throats by trembling hands. The air filled with a sickening chorus, gagging, choking, whispered apologies. Prayers strangled in the throat, and over it all the voice, "There is no pain, there is only peace." The poison was not swift. It lingered, cruel, winding its way through limbs, knotting muscles, seizing breath. Faces turned purple, eyes bulged, tongues swelled as though trying to force words never spoken. The pavilion became a theater of the damned, bodies collapsing, twitching, writhing against the dirt, foaming mouths biting into the soil as if it might save them. The lanterns flickered, shadows leapt. For a moment it seemed as if the walls themselves bent inward, listening, savoring, and through it all, the cups moved hand to hand, passed with a trembling reverence, as though each vessel contained not death but sacrament. "Drink, my children," the voice intoned again, now softer, almost tender. "This is mercy. This is freedom." Some resisted. A woman wailed, clutching her daughter, refusing the cup. She cried out, "No more, no more!" her voice sharp enough to pierce the spell. For a breath, silence fell. Then a guard stepped forward. His face was empty stone, his hands unyielding. He tore the child from her, forced the black rim to her lips. The mother's scream ended in a gurgle drowned in bitter mercy. The daughter followed. The crowd did not gasp. The crowd did not move. They had already been marked. The floor grew wet with spittle and blood, a dark slurry soaking the ground. Flies gathered, buzzing frenzied as though they had been waiting for this feast. The stench of almonds thickened, clinging to hair, skin, lungs, until even breathing tasted of death. Some fell quietly, collapsing as though into sleep. Others clawed at the earth, tearing their nails bloody as they struggled to escape their own bodies. One man tore his throat open with his own hands, the venom eating him from the inside faster than prayer could console. And still the cups passed. The voice spoke once more, soft, intimate, unhurried. Better to die in love than live in chains. Better to drink than to starve. Better to fall together than to stand alone. And those who still lived believed because belief was the only thing left. The last cups were drained. The last hands shook. The serpent had finished its work. The pavilion grew quiet save for the buzzing of flies, the hiss of lanterns burning low, the faint twitching of bodies that would never rise. The faithful lay in heaps, mouths foaming, eyes wide and glassy, their final hymns frozen in silence. And in that stillness the jungle leaned closer. Leaves rustled though no wind stirred. The branches arched as though to close the coffin lid. The cups lay scattered, some overturned, their dregs soaking into the dirt. And as the lanterns sputtered one by one, it seemed as though the shadows of the cups themselves grew longer, stretching across the floor, curling like serpents. The first note was a child's whimper, thin as thread, torn from the throat before it could become a scream. The pavilion groaned beneath the weight of bodies, the air thick with poison sweat and prayers that choked themselves into silence. Lanterns flickered low, painting the walls in jaundiced light, making every face appear already embalmed. Children's cries fell into silence first, smothered beneath the weight of chanting. And the chanting did not rise from one mouth but from many, as though the venom itself had grown a voice. "We are free. We are free." The words trembled, cracked, bled. They came from lips foaming, from throats closing, from lungs filling with the serpent's gift. Some voices rose strong, fervent, clinging to belief with the desperation of drowning men. Others faltered midway, collapsing into coughs and rattles. The sound wove itself into a grotesque hymn, a choir of dying breaths. The night swelled with voices, then collapsed into a stillness too vast to bear. The mothers sang the longest. Their voices, trembling and raw, carried hymns they had taught their children, lullabies twisted into dirges. They rocked limp bodies in their arms, crooning songs as venom stiffened small limbs. Sleep, little one, sleep and wake in light. But no light waited. Only silence. Only the weight of breath turning shallow, then stopping altogether. The children's cries, once piercing, were swallowed into the thick air, vanishing one by one until only the mothers remained. And then their voices too faltered, falling into the black sea of stillness. Outside, the jungle answered. Birds screeched in sudden flight, their wings slapping against branches as though fleeing unseen claws. The trees leaned closer, their canopies rustling like funeral shrouds. Insects stilled, their endless buzzing cut short, as if they too bowed before the darkness filling the clearing. And above it all, the towers loomed. The guards stood motionless, rifles slack in their hands, their silhouettes frozen against the starless sky. From below, it seemed as if the towers themselves were listening, drinking in the last notes of the hymn. "Hold your voices together," the man with the dark glasses whispered. His voice was calm, deliberate, each word a nail driven into wood. "Let the world hear what it cannot understand." The faithful obeyed. Even as their lungs failed, they forced their voices upward, straining, tearing, bleeding sound from failing throats. The hymn rose jagged and broken, filled with coughs, shrieks, moans, until it no longer resembled prayer but a wailing storm. And still, it was beautiful in its terror, a single body of voices, rising as one, breaking as one. Then came the rattling, one by one. Voices thinned into gurgles, the venom choking the last breath before it could escape. The song splintered, fragments echoing in the pavilion. Half-finished hymns, lullabies cut short, cries that dissolved into silence mid-word. The sound was unbearable yet irresistible, drawing the ears like a curse. Soon only a few voices remained, sharp as knives against the silence. Their strength was unnatural, their pitch rising higher, higher, until it felt as though the pavilion itself trembled. Then, as if commanded by some invisible conductor, they stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than sound. It pressed against the skin, clogged the ears, filled the lungs with something thicker than air. The people still alive lay trembling, their eyes wide, their mouths moving without words as if the silence itself had stolen speech. But the hymn was not gone. It lingered. Not from mouths, but from the air itself. The rafters hummed faintly. The earth beneath the pavilion seemed to vibrate. Even the lantern flames quivered in rhythm, as though keeping time with a song no living soul sang. A boy, barely old enough to walk, lay gasping at the edge of the pavilion. His mother's body sprawled across him, stiffening. His eyes darted wide and terrified to the rafters above. His lips parted. "They're still singing," he whispered, though his breath was shallow. "I can hear them in the trees." The guard shifted uneasily. One spat, muttering a prayer. But when the others glanced at the jungle, their faces drained of color. For the branches were swaying in rhythm. The hymn had not died. It had moved. The leaves whispered the words. The wind carried them, faint but clear. "We are free. We are free. We are free." The faithful who still lingered wept, not from fear but devotion, their mouths shaping the same words though no voice came forth. Their eyes glazed, reflecting lantern light like stagnant pools. They were becoming shadows even before the venom finished its work. And then came the final note. It rose not from a throat but from the earth itself, a low vibrating moan that rattled the beams of the pavilion and shook dust from the rafters. The lanterns guttered out one by one, leaving only darkness and the faint shimmer of moonlight through cracks. In that vast silence, the jungle held its breath, and in the last unlit moment, every corpse in the pavilion opened its mouth. The stillness after the hymn was worse than the dying. Bodies lay heaped in the pavilion, sprawled like broken marionettes, their mouths frozen wide in silent song. The air was swollen with the stench of almonds, bile, and sweat. A perfume of devotion curdled into rot. And at the center of it all, not upon a dais, not upon a gilded chair, but upon the dirt itself, he lay among his followers, not raised above them but consumed beside them. The man with the dark glasses, his hands folded across his chest, his head tilted back, his lips slightly parted as if whispering one last command into the poisoned air. And the flies came. They did not come as they had for the others, drawn slowly to the sweet rot of skin. They came as if summoned, not in swarms, in waves, black clouds that spilled from the rafters, from the earth. From cracks in the wooden walls they crowned the silence, their droning a hymn no living soul could endure. Their bodies covered his glasses first, a shifting, seething veil. They crawled across his lips, his ears, his fingers folded in still prayer. They filled the air, thick enough to turn lantern light into shadows, thick enough that breath itself was bitter with wings. The dead did not move. Yet the pavilion trembled with life. Outside, the jungle pressed closer. Vines curled along the posts. Branches sagged inward as though trying to bury what lay within. Birds had vanished. Insects that once hummed the night stilled, silenced by the endless chorus of flies. A guard who had not drunk stood at the threshold, his rifle trembling in his hand. His face was pale, his eyes wide. He whispered, though no one remained to hear him. It wasn't meant for him. He wasn't meant to drink. Yet there he lay, among them, of them, crowned like them. And the guard fled into the jungle, the buzzing chasing him long after the clearing disappeared. The flies grew bolder. They moved not only upon the corpses but through them, crawling into nostrils, mouths, the gaping throats frozen mid-hymn. Their bodies glimmered wet in the moonlight as they disappeared into cavities, as though the dead were vessels meant only to be filled. One by one, the corpses shuddered, not with life but with infestation. A woman's hand twitched against the floor, not from nerve but from the shifting of thousands of tiny legs beneath her skin. A child's chest rose not with breath but with the crawling tide that pressed against his ribs, and still the flies swarmed thickest upon him. His glasses slipped, knocked askew by their fevered bodies. For the first time his eyes were visible. They did not blink. They did not soften. They stared upward, glazed but unbroken, and reflected in their glassy sheen was not the ceiling of the pavilion but the sky itself, red, vast and churning with wings. The flies crawled across his gaze, yet his eyes remained open, fixed, unyielding. It was as though death had not closed him, as though he had chosen to watch. By dawn, the pavilion was unrecognizable. The once white cloth was black, soaked in fluids and crawling bodies. The air was thick, heavy, vibrating with a sound that was no longer the buzzing of flies but the grinding of 1,000 tiny hymns layered atop one another. The jungle recoiled. Leaves curled inward, branches bent away, the green world shuddering at what it now enclosed. But the throne remained, not carved of wood or stone, but formed of bodies writhing and collapsing, their gaps filled by insects, their silence filled by wings. And at its heart, he lay, his dark glasses now swallowed by the swarm, his face blurred, shifting, ever-changing beneath the crawling crown. He is not gone. A voice whispered, low and cracked, from the lips of one who had lingered too long, half dead yet conscious enough to see. He is becoming. The flies lifted suddenly, rising in a black column, a pillar of wings that twisted upward toward the sky. The sound shook the leaves, rattled the bones of the pavilion, turned the air into thunder. They spiraled, forming patterns, letters, symbols no living eye could name, and at the column's base his body was no longer visible. Only the throne of flies remained, pulsing, breathing, watching. The few who survived the cup crawled forward, broken, shaking, eyes glassy. They pressed their faces into the dirt, murmuring through blood and foam, "Crown him, crown him." Their voices blended with the drone until there was no difference between prayer and insect, between hymn and buzzing. And as the sun bled over the trees, the swarm thickened once more, descending not just upon him, but upon every body in the pavilion, stitching them together into a single mass, a single throne, a single kingdom. Rot has a sound, and here it never stops. Jonestown lies broken, swallowed by jungle, its timbers collapsing inward like a mouth caving into its own throat. Yet though the buildings rot, the air hums still, a low, ceaseless drone, too even to be the wind, too restless to be the insects. It is the sound of something unfinished, the sound of a grave that does not wish to be sealed. Curtains move when no hand touches them. Footsteps trace the dust of floors where no shoes remain. At night, when the moon catches the rusted roofs, a faint metallic clink travels the air, like paper cups brushing against one another. Passed hand to hand, though no drink is left within. Jonestown does not sleep. The jungle has tried to reclaim it. Roots coil through the wooden walls. Vines creep over windows, strangling frames until they crack. Yet the plants seem uneasy, hesitant, as if reluctant to devour what lingers here. The earth drinks rain, but not this soil. The trees whisper, but not this clearing. A visitor once described it in a trembling journal entry. The air was thick, as if it remembered. I could feel breath upon my neck, though I stood alone. That visitor left before the sun fell. Most who come do not. Those who remain tell of hymns in the dark. It begins with a murmur, a single thread of song too faint to catch, carried like mist between the ruined halls. Then another voice joins, then another, until the night quivers with a full choir, 100 strong, though no throats remain to give it shape. Father, guide us, Father, keep us. The voices tremble, fracture, then rise until the hymn breaks into a choking chorus. Voices cracking, sputtering, gasping, as though singing and dying at once. The jungle holds its breath until the hymn ends. And when silence falls, it is not peace. It is suffocation. They say the pavilion still reeks. The wooden posts, blackened by sun and rain, still exhale the sour-sweet perfume of almonds, mingled with something deeper, metallic, as if the earth itself had bled and would never clot. On some nights, faint impressions appear upon the ground, the shape of cups pressed into the dirt as though passed and set down again. In others, damp lips have been found upon the rim of broken glass, though no living mouth has touched them for decades. Those who hear the clink of cups at night do not stay until morning. The flies, too, have not departed. Not ordinary flies, not the kind that scatter when swatted. These move together, weaving through the air in slow, deliberate spirals. They hang thickest where the pavilion once stood, their bodies a shifting crown above the ruin. Sometimes they scatter. And when they do, the silence that follows is unbearable, for it is not absence, and it is listening. A researcher once whispered into the dark, "What are you waiting for?" The flies answered with their return. The jungle road remains, a path swallowed in green but never truly erased. Travelers say that when they follow it back to the clearing, they hear voices on either side, whispers urging them forward or back, or deeper still. Drink. Rest. Stay. Some who try to leave find their steps carrying them in circles. No matter how far they walk, They emerge once more before the pavilion's bones. By the third return, the whispers no longer beg. They command, and then the night begins to hum again. There are stories of survivors who return driven by guilt or grief or some gnawing pull in their marrow. They enter the clearing with bowed heads, muttering apologies, prayers, or desperate bargains. None are seen again. But sometimes, the jungle spits out their shoes, their watches, their rings, polished clean as though licked by unseen tongues. Jonestown is no longer a settlement. It is a mouth, its houses gape, their windows jagged teeth. Its pavilion yawns wide, a cavern reeking of what was poured there. Its paths coil inward, leading not to escape but to swallowing. And inside this mouth, silence does not exist. Breath becomes hymn, footsteps become echoes, insects become thunder. Even the dead do not rest here. They wait, they listen, they hum. The legend ends with a warning. They say if you stand in the center of the pavilion at midnight and whisper a prayer, you will hear your own voice join the others, woven into the unseen choir. Your throat will tighten, your lips will part, and you will taste almonds upon your tongue. And when you look down, a paper cup will be in your hand. Cliffhanger image. On the last breath before dawn, the jungle stills. The voices hush. And upon the pavilion floor, where no body remains, a single cup tips over in the dust, spilling nothing. Yet the sound rings out louder than thunder, sharper than bells, as though 1,000 unseen hands had raised theirs in unison. The place refuses silence.